I always knew there was a reason that you can't spell assassin without the double ass. Because when you put two asses together, you get a pair of cheeks. And such is the state of Ubislop's games catalog in 2025. It's important to point out early in my review that I am not criticizing Shadows because of some contrived political agenda that you see on Twitter, the way so many other commentators have for their little grift of the moment. In fact, I was one of the few vocal defenders of Yasuke's inclusion just a year ago. The reasons for disliking Shadows are simply that it is a standard Ubislop slogfest, a mediocre, mid, as the kids say, Ubi shit show that feels more like a chore than escapism, and when you review games as a professional, this just isn't it. It's the game that is composed of copy and paste collectibles, almost as pointless and tedious as its copy and pasted combat system. Ideas that have been better implemented in all such samurai games from which Ubisoft shamelessly follows for the trend of it. It's one of many such modern games riddled with bugs and glitches at launch, though at least these entertain me more than actually playing the game as intended.
And the place I'm at right now, the architecture is really nice. This castle. Kyoto. What the fuck? This fucking... What the... What?
This is one of those games where the reviewer goes for 100% so the audience and the curious public don't have to, and although I'm no stranger to platinums, this one was kind of hard to sit through. I started the game on expert mode expecting a good challenge, only to realize that I, the person that's 100% in every Ninja Guide and Devil May Cry and many other legitimate hack and slash games with difficulty, had nothing to prove and nothing to be ashamed of by lowering the game down to easy mode. Like most open world games, the combat is not there for you to engage with as much as it is to slow you down. I suppose the goal in mind was to kill gamers' senses slowly. Like the pace of the stealth, it's very slow, and you're supposed to come to the shadows after a long day's work, when your senses are dulled anyway. But for a hardcore gamer that's seen it all, Shadows provides very little enjoyment besides the occasional impulsive screenshot that you might take. Yes, it is a very pretty game, but its prettiness is used to mask the boring world. And as pretty as the game looks for a 2025 game and engine, when your source material is Japan, and you put cherry blossoms around every other corner, it's not exactly hard to find appeal. It's a game that lets you change the seasons, to trick you into thinking the game takes on new forms, but it never does. It's a game predicated on playing in the shadows, but you cannot manipulate the day and night cycle. More time-wasting features in a repetitive loop that Assassin's Creed is now known for. Every mission starts the same, with some uninspired monologue initiating a fetch quest. The fetch quest starting point is always 10,000 meters in the opposite direction of where you need to get to. Everything that could be simpler is just more complicated, like needing to grind the same exact minigame just to get the knowledge points, so that you can spend the skill points that you actually earned by playing. So most of the game is spent fast traveling from polar ends of a world that isn't much worth traversing unless you're forced into it, to unlock those fast travels and for the trophies. One of the biggest pieces of proof of oversaturation here is not just the recycling of collectibles, but of locations and the impediments to traversal, like the fucking trees that you get stuck on whenever trying to climb. I get that the hidden locations were supposed to be found through more investigation and using the parkour, but finding these items, these repetitive loot drops that just respawn in the same chest anyway, consists of just holding down L2, and the climbing mechanics are so disproportionately in favor of the kunoichi playstyle that any time you need to go exploring you have to stop and switch characters. It's one of those design choices that I don't actually mind so much, even if it only gives you the illusion of a different playstyle. Following yet another resurgent trend of the dual protagonist, Shadows lets us roleplay as the real historical figure that's obviously, well, probably, embellished a little bit, the obsidian slave turned samurai, Yasuke. And his accomplice, the completely fictional yet full-on waifu material, badass kunoichi named Naoe. With modern ass-cheeks games fashioning themselves as action RPGs, of course we get the absolute unit to complement the low-key assassin lurking in the shadows. Despite all the backlash and casting a Kokujin killer to headline a series where you travel through time to assassinate historical figures, Yasuke is a memorable protagonist in an otherwise forgettable yawn fest. Yasuke is a specimen, Sparta-kicking lesser swordsman into the Shadow Realm, lifting his prey off the ground like a skewer, hitting home runs at the Yakuza cages 400 years before they were even thought of. With naturally more health and more healing, Yasuke's aggressive style of play serves as a refresher to the stealth systems, even though he's got a little bit of sneaking ability all to his own. I like how the game coordinates the characters together in the big missions, letting you pick your playstyle depending on what the moment calls for, which is more often than not payback. Yasuke's historical background as a slave is the perfect setup for him to become bloodthirsty Terminator, dead set on a revenge prawn fantasy. We have to use that term for the YouTube censorship. In this sense, the writers knew what they were doing when casting a black samurai. From my view, it's not so much DEI as it is an attempt to bring some of history's shadowy figures into the light. Yasuke has, of course, been portrayed in similar terms in other media. Took largely crickets from the critics in those cases. I'll come to Ubisoft's defense only here, because playable Yasuke, when done correctly, is always a cool choice. The game's most cinematic and heartfelt moments, words rare to be spoken in favor of a Ubisoft game, feature Yasuke and his flashbacks. Whether or not everything that's been written about, let alone shown to us regarding Yasuke, is historical or not, the most interesting parts, like Yasuke being the chosen bodyguard of the legendary Nobunaga during his final days, are largely plausible if you do your own research, and his epilogue, taking creative license for which there is inconclusive documentation in the real world, is perfectly acceptable within the license of fantasy. My problem with the game's narrative is not the content of the story as much as its delivery. The very first act of the story starts off well. In the midst of the tumult of the warring states, a kunoichi and samurai are divided by one man's rule, and then later united in the wake of his demise. Although the portrayals of these fascinating historical figures is incomplete, as they always will be in fiction, for an Ass Cheeks game, they did some interesting things with the way they frame the true heroes and villains of the period, if you know your history. Games such as Neo handled historical fiction with infinitely more zest. What they tried to do here is respectable, but too little too late for the genre, too subdued in tone and style. It's nothing to make a historian cringe, at least not from what I was able to pay attention to before tuning out and pressing circle to skip most of the dialogue. But it's also nothing to write home about. There's arguably better writing here than in Ghost of Tsushima, but the game is worse in almost every other aspect of its design. In the past half-decade alone, we've seen Rise of the Ronin, Ghost of Tsushima, the legendary Neo, and the much-lauded Sekiro. Sushi's sequel is slated to release this very year, which is another reason to probably skip Shadows. With Shadows being released at the end of a long, cold, lonely winter, it's still going to be a long road ahead for a company that has now fully sold out their remaining controlling interest to the CCP, so they now have no excuse not to enforce a forced agenda, even though I don't think it's so bad here as people have made it out to be. It's just a bad game, in my opinion. But if you're looking for a more in-depth analysis on this garbage, don't expect it from me, because I just don't feel that the game deserves it. The nicest thing I can say about it is that I got it for free, sponsored by Adversary Gaming, and thank the gods for that. This is the first Ass Cheeks game I played from start to end, and probably the last time I take a leap of faith on Ubi shit. I mean, Tencent again. This has been the Commissioner of Games. Good night. God bless. Bad games, but goodbye. As someone that reviews games alone, I at least like to play them with my friends, so I'll let some of them get the final words in. On Ass Cheeks Shit Show.
And see, man, I really can't be asked to play that game.
That's great.
When you do a review, can you make a fucking conscious effort to add a section for me?
Okay.
Specifically about the fact that you get stopped if you just gun for the fucking story, you get stopped because you have to go back and level up and do monotonous side stuff.
That's what's
which is
happening
like
to me right now.
it's fun for the first few times you do it to be like, oh, that's kind of cool, and then it's the same thing over and over and over again, and that's how you get your skill points. This is where I have my problem. If I could just get my skill points by leveling up, I'd be fine. But no, they give you a fuckload of skill points, and they wall you until you do that shit.
I'm saving that.
I'd rather clean the entire house, trash the house, clean the house again, walk the dog, leave the dog outside until he shits everywhere, clean up all the shit and throw it around the house, and then clean that up, then play that game, because that's more mature than any of that. And add that to
Wait,
your,
I'm gonna save that as a clip.
yeah, add that to their.
You're over here being my daddy with the really free games. Incredible.
Son's gotta eat, dude. Gotta bring the dinner to the table.
These people don't care about us.
No, so long as he never poses a threat.
It must be exhausting, seeing enemies everywhere.